indexes the negative qualities that are iconically associated with the language being mocked. So the way it operates, the reason that hasta la vista baby works and au revoir baby doesn't work, and even auf Wiedersehen baby, which would have made more sense, right? He's an Austrian. So auf Wiedersehen, which means the same thing as hasta la vista. I will see you later. Until the next time I see you. But the reason that the hasta la vista works is not got to do with how cool and hip I am, it's got to do with what that language means. What is being indirectly indexed. And in order for it to work, I have to sort of pretend it isn't doing that. Because I can't be a hip, cool, white person if I say racist things. That's the opposite, right? Again, the folk theory of racism is that only uneducated, ignorant hicks are racists. And I would know one if I saw one. And it sure as heck isn't me. Even if I'm making the jokes. Because I didn't mean it, right? And racism in the folk theory is about my intentions. Not about the deeper meaning. And words mean what they mean. Not about the deeper structure that gives them meaning. What we see when we do analysis of these things is that, in fact, the things that make us uncomfortable about this post in the Urban Dictionary, the reason that it became a concern to folks in Linguistics Club, the reason somebody posted it and said, "Ah, this is horrible," is that the connections that it is making are very, very clear. You've got certainly semantic derogation going here, right? When they say, when in doubt, throw in isl sound. That's semantic derogation, like numero 2. And saying there isn't any actual dialect here. As linguists, again, we know perfectly well that African American vernacular English or Black English vernacular or Ebonics, whatever you want to call it, is a rule-governed dialect or a series of regionally distinct rule-governed dialects with their own morphosyntactic rules and their own phonological rules, which can then be spoken correctly or incorrectly. But what this definition does is to say, no, all you gotta do is stick in these things. You've got bold mispronunciation down here in the example, which is not following the actual phonology of I don't have any idea what it is actually. It's not, that is not a statement in African American vernacular English. It's not, it's a nonsense thing. It's a mock form. And it may have euphemism in there, I'm not sure, because I'm trying to figure out, I have no idea what they're talking about, or what they are trying to imply there, what they are indexing. The indexicality of it at the level of euphemism is completely beyond me, but might be indexing something for you. It's kind of like the way that the Super Bowl commercials worked. We were watching them, and my father was watching with us, and there were a couple of them where he was like, no idea what that was. Sometimes we were both like, huh? But you've got really clear mock forms going on here, doing what mock forms do. This person is using these mock forms, and they are using these mock forms to directly index how much of an authority they themselves are, and to indirectly index a number of deeply negative things about people who are associated iconically with this form of language. And when people in Linguistics Club encountered this, there was an immediate response. No, there's something wrong here. This is bad. I want to do something about this. This is horrible, but I don't know what to do about it. So when I came up and said, okay, I want to give this talk, The challenge we face, right, is that if according to the common sense shared by my community of practice, meaning resides unproblematically in words, so it's not about what they index, these indirect indexicality, that's silly, right? It's words mean what they mean. If we think that individual intention is the most important source of meaning, so that I can't unintentionally, without conscious intent, say something that's racist. So if I say, hasta la vista, baby, but I'm not thinking, ha-ha, bad Spanish speakers. If I'm not thinking it in my head, and I know I'm thinking it, then I cannot possibly, according to this folk theory, have done racism. Because it's about intent in the folk theory, not about impact. And if I, at the same time, argue that language is powerful and has material effects, and that it may hurt or heal, then how, given this is my image of what language is, how can we see what Hill talks about, the perpetuation of racism in the intersubjective spaces where meaning is negotiated and inferences are made without ever being made explicit? We have to get past the folk theory, the language ideology, to make the argument that the powerful meanings are not necessarily intended, and the powerful meanings are not necessarily directly connected to the words. But the powerful meanings, the meanings that are shaping those implicit associations, are not the intended ones necessarily, are not the explicit ones necessarily, but are instead the implicit ones and the slippery, slidey ones, the spaces where you can have two meanings under one word. And you have to have both of them, the direct and the indirect indexicality happening at the same time. Those are the powerful spaces. They're powerful because they're shaping the implicit stuff, because they're at that level. But that means that it is not enough to just wait until a race is over and we don't have it anymore. You're really not a equal society. And it is not enough to educate people and tell them how to speak. We have got to get people educated about how this kind of racism is perpetuated. So what can we do? Hill argues that we can put against these ideological structures which are so powerful and so full of meaning, that we can put against them other American values. So look, we've got American values which contradict the values that are part of this ideology about race and racism. We can use those other values. We can use foundational American values, the ideas about equality that are foundational to us can be used against these implicit associations. The idea of responsibility to the group can be used as part of our effort to combat these racist forms. So the idea that we should be civil with one another, that we should respect one another, and that we are all essentially equal. Obviously, it's not perfect. You have to deal with the fact that that equality message connects back to the understanding of human nature as being inherently prone to division, prone to liking our own kind and being different from other folks. And that idea that is the basis of this myth of reverse racism, right? That gets supported by equality too. So you have to find a way to bring nuance to it. But you can use ideas like respect and civility and equality to combat things like the Ebonics definition in the Urban Dictionary, to point to the disrespect and to point to the lack of civility in it, to point out over and over again if we have to, that Labav and other linguists have demonstrated that African American vernacular is a dialect, has rules, is not some lazy form, but in fact has a grammar, has phonology, has rules, and that you have to recognize it as equal. Michael Agar points out that we can do this in a way that allows us to get past the idea of fault. And I think it's useful to get past fault, because again, if it's not about intent, then it really doesn't need to be about fault. Because we aren't trying to make people feel guilty. We're not trying to make ourselves feel guilty. We're trying to make ourselves aware of what we're doing, so that we can stop doing it. We're trying to get ourselves to think critically. If you make people feel at fault, they start battling. They start saying, no, I'm not. They start defending themselves. And the whole point here is not to get people defensive and battling. The whole point is to shift this very large ideological structure that has 500 years of weight behind it in ways that make it something else, that change it, that revolutionize it. So, Agar says we can do mistake awareness repair, which is a space within which we can interrupt the language of white racism. And again, Hill isn't saying stop the language, because she's not thinking you can. There's a lot of it that you just can't stop. It's just going. You know, we're trying to talk to the author of the Skippy John Jones books, and boy, she didn't like that. She resisted fiercely the idea that she was contributing to racism with her cute little chihuahua. Her Siamese cat, he thinks he's a chihuahua. Yeah, she's, no, I'm not. And, but you can interrupt it. And if you interrupt it persistently, it gets harder and harder to do the well done. If you're constantly interrupted, then it's harder to do well done. And the harder you make it to do well done, the more you change what the well done is. So Agar says you can do this in the form of mistake awareness repair. He's talking here about intercultural communication, but I think his tool works nicely for this, because I think we can think about it as intercultural or interpersonal communication. It says you can run into these situations where you can look at that thing like that definition of Ebonics in Urban Dictionary, and instead of saying bad, you can say, whoops, that was a mistake. What was mistaken about that? I can do that when I say hasta la vista, baby. I say, oh, let's go and numero 10 and numero 20. And then I can think, oh, shoot, that was a mistake. What was my mistake? I can become aware of it. And then I can figure out how to repair it. Hill, in terms of the mock Spanish, has said, well, the way you repair that is you put all those things away, the coffee mugs and the jokes and the greeting cards and the habits of speech, and you do not bring them out again until there is no racism against people who are associated with Spanish language. And when it is the case that the levels of wealth and incarceration and education and health and infant mortality and all of those things, when all of those things are no longer badly skewed according to this social and political reality, then you can say hasta la vista, baby, again. But until then, you don't get to. You gotta pick your battles, and you gotta persevere. These structures of meaning were not created overnight. And they're not gonna be transformed overnight. They're not gonna be cured. We're not gonna achieve perfection. But we can continue to do something about it. We can, in fact, work through these structures of meaning, and we can work within these structures of meaning, and we can transform these structures of meaning, and we can do that because we made these structures of meaning. They were not imposed upon us. Maybe people like me make them and impose them upon other folks, but people like me are not victims of them. We are authors of them. So I think that there is not necessarily some kind of miraculous cure right around the corner for these structures of meaning which create and maintain and preserve institutional racism in this country. But I do think that if we are aware of them, and we pay attention to them, and we think about the implications of what we say when we say it, and we recognize these things when they occur, that we can, chipping away at it all together on a daily basis, eventually transform the structures. And that is the hope that I leave you with. I have very little time for questions, but I can hang out later if you need. I know people have had to leave because they have jobs.